Okay, guys, today we're going to talk about the anatomy of the respiratory system first, and then in the next recording, we're going to cover the physiology. And this should help you understand the lab, the pulmonary ventilation. Functions of the respiratory system. So, obviously, when you think of respiratory system, what do you think of? You think of gas exchange, right? Um, what else do you think of? Do you think of warming air, maybe? One of the big ones is gas exchange. Okay, so um, the lungs provide extensive area or extensive surface area for gas exchange, okay, between the air and the circulating blood. When we get into it, we'll see that the alveoli are sacs, and they're multiple bundles of sacs. They're kind of like clusters of grapes, if you will. And so whenever you see folds or clusters, that is to increase surface area to internal volume, and so that you can have more surface area for gas exchange. Another function of the lungs is to filter, warm, and humidify air, to move air from um, the exchange surfaces of the lungs, right? So you're going to take air in through the mouth and nose, and then you have to get it down to the alveoli so that the oxygen can move into the bloodstream and CO2 can get kicked out. You want to protect those respiratory surfaces from outside environment. So there's cilia, there's mucus, and uh, it provides speech and it aids in pH regulation. So cells require oxygen for cellular metabolism, for maintenance, growth, defense, and division, right? So last semester you covered cellular metabolism, and the point of cellular metabolism was to get ATP to, rebuild plasma membranes, to drive pumps, to fuel skeletal muscle contractions. And so the purpose of getting oxygen in is for all of these things. Okay, so your cells require oxygen, and carbon dioxide is a byproduct of metabolism. And so you need to get oxygen into those cells and CO2 out. The respiratory system aids in this. Remember, back to when we talked about blood, anytime you have CO2 and water or plasma, that's going to make your carbonic acid. And when you make carbonic acid, that's going to dissociate into protons and bicarbonate ions. So you need to deal with this free protons, as well as the tissues are going to release protons. So you have acidification of any area that's producing carbon dioxide, so basically any tissues. Your cells, the lungs, well, your cells need to kick out CO2, right, and take in oxygen. You don't want CO2 sitting around and making acid and acidifying the tissue, and you need oxygen for complex 4 to make ATP. So the respiratory system and the circulatory system are going to do this for you. Let's cover the anatomy first. So we can separate the anatomy into upper respiratory system and lower respiratory system. Let's look at the upper respiratory system. So basically it is your nose and the nasal passageways, and we'll go into a little bit more depth in a minute, the mouth, the throat area, which is your pharynx, and then everything to your vocal cords, so a portion of your larynx. Lower respiratory tract is vocal cords all the way down to your lungs and your diaphragm. Let's take a look at the nose. So the entrance to the nose are the nares. Then you have your nasal cavity, right? You know that there are hairs in the nasal cavity and mucus. And so the hairs and mucus trap debris. In Southern California, we have fires on a regular basis. And so these hairs and mucus are going to trap the ash. And you notice that when you blow your nose on when we've had fires, that ash comes out in the mucus. And so the nares are doing their job. The mucosa warms and moistens air, right? Cilia transport debris out, and your nasal conch bones are responsible for airflow. You learned the nasal conch when you went over the skeleton, well, actually I should say the skull bones. And they're responsible for airflow direction. They're responsible for humidifying the air, heating and filtering inhaled air. Then you have olfactory receptors and tear drainage. Here's a diagram of the different types of cells or the epithelium that lines the nasal cavity. So if you take a look at the trachea and bronchi, this is pseudostratified ciliated columnar. So what does that mean? Pseudostratified is falsely stratified, right? Ciliated has cilia hairs. And columnar is a shape of the epithelium. So this is pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Notice that there are mucus cells or goblet cells, right? These guys are going to produce mucus, and then the cilia are going to beat and cause a current to push mucus up out of the bronchi and trachea into the esophagus. And so this is how we trap debris and dirt, and this is, bacteria and whatnot, and kick it out of the respiratory system. You have paranasal sinuses, so we have 4 of them. These are spaces in bones that are aligned with mucous membranes. These empty into your nasal cavity, and they provide resonation of sound. These also can get infected, so if you have a bacteria or a virus that is in the nasal cavity, can work its way up through the paranasal sinuses and cause an infection. Internal nares is the opening between the nasal cavity and the nasal pharynx, and then the pharynx is your throat between the nasal cavity and the larynx. It's a passageway for air and food, so the pharynx, air and food both share the pharynx, and it's separated into the naso, oro, and laryngeal pharynx. Let me show you a picture. Okay, so here is your nares, here is your nasal passageway, right? Here are your nasal conch, so there's 3 of them, and those are folds that help humidify and filter air. The internal nares, and then the nasopharynx is the back. Then the oropharynx is called the oropharynx because it's connected to the oral cavity. And then the laryngopharynx is called laryngopharynx because it's near the larynx. So when they do, lately in the news, we've been talking about COVID-19, the virus. When they do a virus test, or when they test for this, they have to take the swab and stick it all the way back in the nasopharynx and get some tissue from the nasopharynx to see if there are viruses in the tissue. The oropharynx has the tongue, right? And then the back side of that is where your oropharynx is, and then we get into the larynx, the trachea. Keep in mind, the pharynx is where the food, so food is going to come down here, plus air, and then the food goes down the esophagus, right, which is leading to the stomach, which is your digestive tract, and then the air is going to go into the trachea. What makes sure that air goes down the trachea or food goes down the esophagus? It's actually the epiglottis right here. And so this epiglottis closes when you swallow to let food go down the esophagus. When you're taking a breath, the epiglottis opens so that air can move in and out of the trachea. Here are a couple of sinuses that you can see. So the frontal sinus is right there, your frontal bone, and then the sphenoid sinus is in your sphenoid bone. Your pharynx is protected by tonsils that contain lymphocytes and macrophages. You have 4 different types of tonsils, or 4 sets of tonsils. 4 tonsils. The pharyngeal tonsils are considered to be the adenoids. These are the ones that people usually have issues with, or that they get burned out or removed, if you will. Then tubal tonsils, those are by the posterior entrance of your auditory tubes, or your eustachian tubes. The tubes connect your inner ear to your throat. The palatine tonsils are tonsils that you can actually see in the back of your throat. So when you have a cold, or if you've had a strep throat, these are the ones that you can see get infected. And then the lingual tonsils, are on the posterior surface of the tongue. So let's take a look at the tonsils. The pharyngeal tonsils are right here. And then your other set of tonsils are on the opening of, or near the auditory tube or your eustachian tube. This tube actually connects, if you fall through, this tube connects your throat to your inner ear. Then we have the palatine tonsils right here, and then the lingual tonsils are on the back side of the tongue. These guys you can't see, these ones you can, they're on the sides. These guys obviously you can't see as well. And then here's a close-up of it. If you look at the bottom, mucous membrane and connective tissue, right? And then you have the glands that open into the bottom of the crypts, okay? And these are little lymphatic follicles that hold the lymphocytes and then the macrophages. And you can see that these guys are folds of tissue, and they're supposed to help be sort of a first line of defense against bacteria and viruses. But what ends up happening a lot of times is these guys get really irritated and inflamed, and they trap mucus and debris in them, and they cause more problems than good for us. So the larynx has cricoid cartilage to keep it open. This is part of the lower respiratory tract. Two functions of the larynx, obviously to keep movement of food and air separate, and then provide sound for speech. And so the larynx is where your vocal cords are housed, and the larynx, on top of the larynx, you have the epiglottis that closes so that food and air can keep separate. The glottis is a slit-like opening into the larynx that produces speech with vocal cords. Your epiglottis, which is made up of cartilage, covers that glottis and prevents food from entering the trachea. Your thyroid cartilage is a main cartilage piece of your larynx. We consider that to be the Adam's apple. And then your cricoid cartilage are sort of like, we call them C cartilages for short, and they're on the anterior side. They're inferior, and they wrap around those vocal cords, or encompass those vocal cords, or house those vocal cords. So here's a laryngoscope view of your larynx. So this is anterior, this is posterior. Take a look at your vocal cords right there, right? Here is the main cartilage that I want you to know is the epiglottis. So the epiglottis is coming out towards you, and it's a flap. I'll show you a better picture in a minute. This is actually the root of the tongue. So this is where your tongue connects. If you look at the picture on the left-hand side, here's your glottis. It's actually open, and then here's your glottis. It's closed, and then there's vocal cords on either side of that glottis. Let me show you a different picture. And so here is the larynx, right? And so this whole thing is called the larynx. The main piece of the larynx is thyroid cartilage, and then this is a membranous part of the larynx. Here's your hyoid bone. So that hyoid bone sort of, when you learned it last semester, it sort of floats, but it's actually really connected to the membranous part of the larynx. It protects the epiglottis. Then you have your cricothyroid ligament in your cricoid cartilage, and then you have your tracheal cartilage, okay? The cricoid cartilage protects the vocal cords, and then your tracheal cartilage holds, they're kind of like C's, and they hold the trachea open. So they protect the trachea, hold the trachea open. If you flip this around and look at the posterior view, here's the epiglottis, right? Here is your whole larynx, and then here is the portion of your voice box that's cut away. The side view, this is actually better. So here's the epiglottis, and you can see that when the epiglottis is open, air can come up and down through the larynx and the trachea, and your vocal cords are right there in the thyroid cartilage. The thyroid cartilage protects the vocal cords. And so this provides speech. And when you're eating, or when you're swallowing, the epiglottis covers this and encloses this or protects this so that food doesn't go down the trachea, so that food has to go down the esophagus. The esophagus is right behind the trachea. Your trachea, which is your windpipe, this is considered part of the lower respiratory tract as well. It's supported by tracheal cartilage in the front, so it doesn't collapse. And then there's no cartilage in the back. Remember, the esophagus is right behind it, so you need to swallow, right? Then there's a bronchial tree. It goes main trachea, which is your windpipe, then your primary bronchi, then it branches off into secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, bronchioles, terminal and respiratory bronchioles, and then alveolar ducts and alveoli. So this is greatest size to smallest, or alveoli are actually what we call the functional unit of the lungs. Here is a histological slide of the trachea. So here's your trachea. Notice this is tracheal cartilage. And then here's your epithelial layer, right? This is what? Pseudostratified ciliated columnar. And notice behind it, what do we have? Good, we have the esophagus, that's for food. This is for air. Notice on the left and right, so we have the common carotid right there, artery, and notice there's a lot of elastic fibers, the dark coloration. And then take a look at the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland, and we haven't talked about that, but that's on our list to talk about next for endocrine. Thyroid gland regulates metabolism and body temperature. Thyroid gland sits in front of your larynx, and then on the back side of the thyroid gland is your parathyroid. This picture shows you the bronchial tree, right? So here's your trachea, then you have a primary bronchus, you have two primary bronchus, instead of saying bronchus, it's bronchi, so two primary bronchi, right? And then you have a secondary bronchus, and then a tertiary bronchus, and then a bronchioles. So it goes primary bronchus, then the second branch is secondary bronchi, and then the other one is tertiary bronchi, and then bronchioles, okay? If you look at the picture to the right, this becomes the bronchioles, and then the alveolar duct, and then the alveoli, or the alveolar sacs. And so notice that the trachea is large, and then the bronchi get smaller in diameter, but they're more numerous. And this is a way, even if we got smaller, or if the diameter got smaller and there weren't many, then we'd have a lot of resistance to airflow, and that we wouldn't be able to get air in. But what your lungs do, or how we get around that, is we have way more bronchioles and alveolar ducts and alveoli, so that we decrease the resistance to airflow. And so if you look at the microscopic view, here's an alveolar sac, and then each one of these, it looks like a grape, it's an alveolus. And then you have, notice in the other picture, you have your tributary of your arterial, your pulmonary arterial, right? And then your pulmonary vein. This actually should be flipped. An artery should, the pulmonary artery doesn't have, it's deoxygenated, or it has less oxygen, so that should be blue, and then the pulmonary vein is going back to the lung, so that should be red. So note that in your picture. Here's a better picture of this. So left primary bronchus, right? Then your secondary bronchus, tertiary bronchi, and then bronchioles, and then your alveolar duct, and then your alveolar sacs. I like this picture too because it shows the smooth muscle wrapped around the bronchioles. And so this smooth muscle is going to constrict and dilate and regulate the diameter of the bronchioles for airflow. Yellow is nerve, green is lymphatic, blue is artery, remember, and red is vein, because for pulmonary artery and vein, they're flipped. So take a look. Here's your tributary of your pulmonary artery. It's going to end in a capillary bed, and it's almost like it's a mesh net wrapped around the alveolar sacs. And then the capillary goes into the pulmonary vein, or a tributary of the pulmonary vein, and it's going to go back to the heart. So from the heart to the lungs, back to the heart. So you pick up oxygen. So take a look at these capillaries. This is a capillary bed, and what ends up happening is the red blood cells flow through here single file, and they pick up oxygen and kick out CO2. Notice that there's a lot of elastic fibers, so it's kind of hard to see in this picture. If you look at the picture, the teal sort of bands are the elastic fibers. And so these are going to help with the stretch and recoil of the alveolar sacs. Excuse me. Notice in the upper picture on the left-hand side, your diaphragm is right here. And then you have your pleural cavity that surrounds the lungs, and we'll talk about that in a second. Your lungs are paired organs. They're spongy. The top is the apex, so it's flipped from the heart. Remember, the bottom of the heart was apex. The top of each lung is apex, and it actually sits right under and above the clavicle, and the bottom is the base. Your left lung has two lobes, upper and lower lobe, that's separated by the oblique fissure, has a depression in it for the aortic arch and heart. And then the right lung has three lobes, superior, middle, and inferior. They're located in the thoracic cavity, lateral to the heart and superior to the diaphragm. They're protected by visceral and parietal pleura. Okay, and so this, the lungs sit in the pleural cavity. What type of membranes are these guys? Remember? Good, so they're serous membranes. And so take a look at the picture. Here is your right lung. So here's your superior, your middle and inferior lobe, and then your left lung is superior and inferior. Notice that the left lung is smaller, and notice that it has this cardiac notch. So this is where the heart sits. This allows for the aorta to come through. And notice these deep lines are fissures, right? Deep folds. And then here's a base of the lungs, and then the apex sits right under and above or anterior to the clavicle. And then the diaphragm is going to be right here. If you take a look at the linings of the lungs, so if you look on the right-hand side of your picture, I have them highlighted. So here's the lung, right? And then the visceral pleura is a connective tissue layer that's connected to the lung. And then the parietal pleura, which is right here, is the connective tissue that's connected to the thoracic cavity. Between those two is called the pleural cavity. So the pleural cavity actually is full of serous fluid, and it allows the lungs to expand and deflate, and it decreases tension so that, or friction, so that the lungs don't tear. You also have fluid inside of the lungs, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but the fluid inside of the lungs prevents surface area. It's actually surfactant. It's kind of surfactant. It's kind of like a soap, if you will, but it's a surfactant that the body makes. So it sort of cleanses the lungs, bathes the lungs, and makes sure that the lungs stay inflated. In order to keep the lungs inflated, this pleural cavity has to have negative pressure. So you have the visceral pleura pushing out, and then the parietal pleura pushing this way so that they stay inflated. And so when the chest cavity moves, or when the chest wall moves, because you're contracting muscles, this is all going to function as one unit. If you think of microscope slides or pieces of glass, you know, when you have microscope slides and you put water in between those two microscope slides and they stick, because of suction or negative pressure, it's the same process. So you can think of the visceral pleura is suction to the parietal pleura. And so when the parietal pleura moves, the pleural cavity and visceral pleura and lungs are going to follow suit with that movement. Take a look at the heart. So the heart is in its own little cavity, right? The pericardial cavity. And then the lungs are in their own little cavity, the pleural cavity. This region right here is, if you look up at the picture on the left on the top, this is called the mediastinal region. And so the heart sits in its own little region called the mediastinal region. Alveoli are microscopic membranous air sacs. They are composed of simple squamous epithelial tissue. So if it's simple squamous epithelial tissue, how many layers are there? Good. So simple is one layer, and squamous would be that fried egg shape, and it's epithelium. The alveoli is a functional unit of gas exchange, right? So it's a functional unit of the lungs, and it's where gas exchange happens. Has surfactant, so that reduces the surface tension and prevents the alveoli from collapsing. Take a look. So here are the alveoli. Here's your alveolar duct, and then alveolar. This is a longitudinal section, magnified 42 times the original size, right? And here's, I think this is a scanning electron micrograph of it, so you get an idea of how numerous these are. If you were to look at the gas exchange space, you would notice that there's one layer of squamosal cells that the alveolus is made up of, and then one layer of squamosal cells that the capillary is made up of. Capillaries only have one layer instead of the three that arteries and veins usually have, because you need to allow for diffusion. You have to have only one layer, because if you had more layers, oxygen and CO2 wouldn't be able to move through. So, and we have different types of epithelial cells. So this is a type 1 cell. Notice that oxygen has to go through this membrane, the basement membrane, and then the other cell to get into the bloodstream. And CO2 likewise has to diffuse out. And so red blood cells go through this region single file so that oxygen can load on and CO2 can get kicked off. Here's a better picture of it. So top picture here is the capillary. This shows a little bit more of that mesh network, if you will. Here's your capillaries, and then here is your alveolus, right? And then here is a macrophage, and then a surfactant producing cell, and then here's a gas exchange area. Notice there's mitochondria in there, right? Okay. This concludes the anatomy. I'm going to stop here, and then I'm going to pick up with the physiology in a different recording. Let's see. I can stop it.